I met Steven Pinker in around 2002 when he came to the American Enterprise Institute, which is where I work, to talk about the blank slate. Clearly his reputation had preceded him because he's one of the best known psychologists both within the profession and also outside. And we've been friends since, and I've come to enjoy and deeply admire his dazzling intellect, and also what a lovely person he is. Steve Pinker did his undergraduate work at McGill and then got a PhD in cognitive psychology at Harvard. He went to Stanford as an assistant professor, then to MIT for 21 years, and in mid-2000s, back to Harvard as the Johnstone Family Professor. The breadth and depth of his work is quite astounding. His scholarship and empirical research has ranged from mental imagery to shape recognition, visual attention, children's language acquisition, the neural basis of grammar and words, the psychology of cursing, and the decline of violence, and how to write well. He's authored 7 popular books, beginning in 1994 with The Language Instinct, then How the Mind Works, Words and Rules, The Blank Slate, The Stuff of Thought, Better Angels of Our Nature, and his latest and 7th, The Sense of Style. And 2 of those books were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. Finally, he's steeped in much deserved recognition in spite of, or maybe because of, the taboos that he's been willing to take on. He's won awards from the American Psychological Association, the National Academy of Sciences, the American Humanist Association, among others. In 2004, he was named one of Time's most influential thinkers or people in the world, and then also by Foreign Policy and Prospect, one of the top 100 public intellectuals, and also by Foreign Policy, one of the top global thinkers. And next year from this organization, the Association of Psychological Science, he will be awarded the William James Fellow Award. So let's get started by asking you, how did you get to be Steve Pinker with respect to your parents, your upbringing, and your early years in general?
You wouldn't think that would be a complicated question, but one of the blessings or curses of being a psychologist is you can't even take a question like that at face value, because I don't think anyone has any idea what made them who they are. For one thing, our retrospective accounts of our childhood have to leave out many of the most important things that make us who we are, starting with the genes. I mean, Hans Eysenck, the great psychologist, said that the greatest influence that parents have on their children is at the moment of conception. And we know that the research since then has borne him out. Unless you have an identical twin who is separated at birth from you, you have no idea what the influence of genes are on your intellect or your temperament. Unless you have someone who is adopted into your family at the same time as you, who is not biologically related, you have no idea what the influence of your parents are. And we have reason to believe from a lot of behavior genetics studies that the effects of parents are overrated, because adopted siblings, by the time they're adults, correlate very poorly, close to 0 in intellect and personality. And unless you grow up with an identical twin who shares both your heredity and your environment, and you see differences from your identical twin, you don't have any way of appreciating the role of chance. And I think there's an enormous and underappreciated role of sheer randomness in making us who we are. Just randomness in how the axons twist and turn when the brain develops, and little accidents that happen to you as you grow up that might shift you on one or another path that you have no way of reconstructing. So take with a grain of salt anything that I say from now on, because I don't think we have any of us has any idea what made us who we are. But I'll start. I chose my parents well. My father, Harry Pinker, who I lost just a few weeks ago, and my mother, Rosalind Pinker, both highly verbal, talented in math. My mother's, Rosalind Pinker, highly intellectual and verbal, and I certainly grew up in a house filled with conversation. It was a secular Jewish household, so there's a lot of debate and disputation. There's an old saying, 10 Jews, 11 political parties. There were books and magazines and newspapers in the house. When I was a teenager, my mother gave me as a gift a subscription to the Time Life Science series, where every month a different volume would come in on a different scientific topic: electricity and magnetism, and light, and the planets, and forests. But one month it was the mind, and I do remember being quite intrigued by that Time Life volume, and perhaps that more than anything led me to appreciate psychology as an interesting thing to do. On the other hand, when I was at Stanford, my office mate was my friend Herb Clark, also a professor of psychology interested in psychology of language. He grew up in Deadwood Gulch, South Dakota. So this is a good reason to take with a grain of salt anything that attributes your professional interest to the neighborhood in which you grew up.
Right. You said that at 13 you were even interested in human nature, yet your early work was on vision. How did that come about, and what was one of your first projects?
Yeah, I think another thing that I like to think influenced my interest was growing up in the 60s. I was a baby boomer, and in the 60s you had to decide whether you were going to be an anarchist or a Marxist or an Ayn Randian, or everything was very ideological, and those ultimately boil down to questions about human nature. If you're an anarchist, you must have a fairly rosy view of human nature to think that people can coexist without a leviathan to keep them from each other's throats, and so it is for the other political ideologies. So I do remember having debates with friends over whether we need money or people would just naturally take their fair share, whether we need police or people would naturally cooperate. But you can't get an undergraduate degree in human nature. So you have to pick a discipline, and psychology seemed to me a sweet spot between grappling with big, important, consequential ideas, but doing so in a way that was tractable, that you could study it in the lab. I found myself gravitating to Steve Kosslyn, who had just been hired at Harvard when I was a graduate student, and and Steve has been a friend ever since. He was just 6 years older than me at the time. He was 28, I was 22, but he was building a research program on visual imagery and visual cognition. Both of us were, I think, entranced by an idea that has governed my work ever since, the idea that there is an important level of understanding for psychology in between the world of common sense explanation, like, I went to the fridge because I was thirsty and I wanted a Coke, or I'm going to vote for Hillary because I like her record on foreign policy, the kind of content of everyday conversation, of ideas and meaning, and the level of neurophysiology, and that level is computation. That is, that thinking is a form of information processing, that knowledge is a form of information, that motives and desires are cybernetic feedback mechanisms, and that is the level at which you can have a scientific psychology that is neither reduces to common sense nor goes down to the level of neurons and neurotransmitters, and that there are many laws of thought and emotion that can best be framed at that level. Steve at the time was doing that for mental imagery, for the ability to form mental pictures to answer questions like what shape are Mickey Mouse's ears? Most people say, well, I never really thought about that, but no, okay, oh yeah, they're round. Or how do I arrange the suitcases to fit into a trunk? Or if I'm writing a novel or telling a story, how do people enter and leave the room? All the kinds of things we conjure up in our mind's eye. But what does that mean? And Steve, I think, was the first to come up with a computational theory of what it could mean to think in pictures or images. And at the time, this was thought by a lot of people to be a mistake. This was the era before there was affordable computer graphics, where computation meant you would type strings of text into a computer and you'd get strings back. And no one could even conceive of what it would mean to have a picture. And a lot of bad philosophy was mustered to show that this was paradoxical. Oh, if there was a picture in the head, you'd need a little man to look at the picture, and then you'd need a little, even smaller picture inside the head of the little man, or it's all, to say you have a mental image is all a category mistake. It's like saying for Pete's sake and then walking around looking for Pete. So there are all these, I think, in retrospect, bogus arguments as to why mental imagery was incoherent. And Steve had an intuition that the notion of what we would today call graphics, namely you could have a representation consisting of what we now call pixels, I don't even know if the word existed in that time, and a more abstract kind of web-like database from which the images could be generated piece by piece, could account for our ability to form and use images. And there was one note in one of his papers that I read as a graduate student that I realized opened up a whole world of questions, where, namely, how do you represent the third dimension in an image? And we clearly can imagine three-dimensional shapes when you take organic chemistry, or for that matter, when you study the brain and you have to sort of mentally rotate it and see it from different angles, or approach it from the inside. Third dimension has to be there, but it can't just be adding layers of depth, that is, make it a set of voxels, as we would now call them, volume elements instead of pixels, because then you wouldn't get perspective. And when you form an image, if you imagine standing between railroad tracks, they converge, which the voxels don't in a 3D representation, and things get smaller as they move away. And trying to resolve that paradox of how a information representation of space could both have the third dimension and have the effects of a vantage point in perspective was what set me off on my thesis.
Wow. It sounds actually incredibly complicated. So how did you get from that to language acquisition?
So it was, I had to be kind of opportunistic as a graduate student. Harvard at the time actually had very few cognitive psychologists. They didn't give tenure to any of their cognitive psychologists. They thought it was a passing fad, that only mathematical psychology was true science. And so I went after the only cognitive science that was actually happening there, which was language development in children. Roger Brown, the great social psychologist and founder of psycholinguistics, was on the faculty. And staying with the key idea that psychology is best understood as a form of computation, I tried to think of what would be the algorithm that a child would be born with that would take sentences as input, the kind of things you'd hear from your parents and your siblings and your friends, and produce as output the ability to speak English or Japanese or Swahili or any other language. So what goes into that black box? And I start off more as a theoretician, namely, what could the child be born with that would allow him to do that learning? And then that led to a number of questions in more concrete areas of grammar. How does the child learn endings on verbs and nouns, meaning of words, how to flip the subject and auxiliary to pose a question? And so it was really theoretically driven.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, this was the 80s, around the 80s and early 90s. How is it that you didn't get sort of swept up into the neuroscience world? I mean, PET came out in the 80s and then fMRI in the 90s, and it's certainly been enormously attractive to many folks, but you stayed at a different level.
I am a psychologist. I have done a number of studies in collaboration with others and with using cognitive neuroscience techniques. I'm an author on one fMRI paper, one paper looking at patients with focal lesions and with degenerative diseases, and a third paper where we collaborated with neurosurgeons who actually implanted electrodes that impale the brain and grids that sit on the surface of the brain, not to satisfy their curiosity, but to treat and diagnose epilepsy. And fortunately, these patients kind of sitting around waiting to have a seizure were all too happy to relieve their boredom by taking some psycholinguistics experimental procedures. But aside from those forays, I have remained a psychologist. I'm not a neuroscientist. And partly when I was an undergraduate and I did help out in a neuroscience lab, I realized I should not pick a career that depended in any way on my manual dexterity. I missed the dentate gyrus by a mile, and
So you got
I realized
somebody else's.
Yeah. So anything that involves surgery was not for me. But also, I really do believe, and this is a belief we share. You have a book with Scott Lilienthal called "Brainwashed" on mindless neuroscience. That a lot of insight, depth, explanation, understanding of human behavior, thought, emotion is not to be found at the level of neurophysiology, but at a higher level of analysis. And for me, that would be the level of information processing.
Yeah. So your book, The Language Instinct in 1994, obviously took you out of the lab, which is certainly a cloistered environment, and brought you into the public. Why did you decide to write a book about language for the public?
It was a combination of things. Well, I was an avid consumer of books by scientists for a wider readership. Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Dawkins, Martin Gardner for mathematics, George Gamow, Isaac Asimov. But no one had really done that for psychology, at least for cognitive psychology, for language and thought. And when I would tell people what I did for a living, the reaction would always be, wow, that's really interesting. And I thought there really is a niche for a kind of Stephen Jay Gould style book explaining our science at a high level for a wide readership. And then I'd written two books that are, as they say about the Vegematic, not sold in stores. These were university press books, highly technical books on language. But one of the editors at MIT Press said, and I paraphrase here, for an academic, your writing doesn't suck. And said, have you ever thought of trying your hand at writing for a wider audience? And that's what led me to do The Language Instinct.
And talk a little bit about the transition from, again, being an academic, which you still are, of course, but into being really a culture warrior.
Well, I've often, and I think most people do that as as their career meanders, but you get feedback from the world as to what the world finds most interesting about the various things that you do or could do. When my research activities, when I changed the ratio in my portfolio from kind of 50-50 visual cognition and language to more and more language, it was in response to my seeing that people were just much more interested in the work that I did in language. I got more invitations to write book chapters and give talks and so on. And so I shifted the mixture there. And then likewise, as I started to write about topics of interest to the wider public, the wider public seemed to want more. And that too shifted the ratio.
Yeah. Well, what were some of what was the reception to your early book in terms of, were there critics of it?
Well, the Language Instinct in particular, my first book for a wide audience, got almost entirely positive reviews. And the last time, the last time that I enjoyed that blessed state. But, and I was surprised. I was told by friends and colleagues who had written books for a wider audience, the typical book will be in the bookstores. A bookstore, by the way, is this building where they have shelves and you can, and then gone forever. And I wrote it with that in mind. I had no idea that it would still be in print 24 years later, that it would be reviewed in the New York Times. So I walked into it with low expectations. And when it was widely reviewed and widely noticed, I was surprised and delighted. And it didn't strike people, that many people, as controversial. I think I got one negative review from, because the book touched on some controversies within the field of psycholinguistics. And in one of the academic journals, there was a fairly critical review. But the others, both in the popular press and the other academic journal reviews, were highly positive.
Great. Well, speaking of then critics, I have a list here of people with whom you've had friendly and maybe a little bit sometimes tense academic debates. So I'm going to read this list. And then it's a long list. I think I left some people out, actually. But okay. So one with Noam Chomsky on the role of natural selection and the origin of language, and even the very purpose of language. You seem to have an interesting theory about that. Jerry Fodor about how the mind works. A debate with Elizabeth Spelke on the social and evolutionary basis of sex differences in cognition. Stephen Jay Gould and Stephen Rose on the evolutionary grounding of human behavior and anxiety about biological determinism. John Gray, he's a philosopher, right? Yeah, who excoriated you as a defender of the Enlightenment values, how dare you, while arguing for a declinist view of civilization. He was, you're far more optimistic, in The Better Angels of Our Nature. Then Leon Kass, who actually is a colleague of mine at the American Enterprise Institute. Well, I admit I sided with Professor Pinker on this, but arguing about the very concept of human dignity and bioethics. This was in the context of the President's Council on Bioethics under President George Bush with respect to stem cell research. And Stephen wrote this wonderful article in the New Republic related to that, and also testified before their commission, questioning the concept of, not the concept of human dignity, but its context in stem cell research. And also Leon Wieseltier, who is the former literary editor of the New Republic, on the relationship between science and the humanities. So I guess my question is, which of those was the most, it's sort of productive, I suppose, or in terms of a lot of these debates, you know, a lot of heat but no light, or people just remain entrenched on their sides. But which ones would you say were the most productive, and how?
Well, I like to think that I learned from all of them, that again, as psychologists, we're blessed or cursed with the knowledge that most of our knowledge isn't, that we're apt to overestimate how correct we are and how wise we are, how much we know, and that you really can only understand something if you have it attacked and then have to reconstruct what's defensible. So I think I learned from all of them. You know, I think I was right with all of them, but I wouldn't I?
Is there one that, I guess I'm trying to, I suppose I'm trying to get, trying to tease out almost the, well, which one was the most protracted? Do they, I mean, they play out in magazines, they play out in, on panels.
You know, I think certainly the debate on the, you know, whether the human mind is a blank slate. I mean, it goes back to the empiricists and rationalists of the 17th century. You know, I do think we're making progress in it. I think that, of course, it's not either or, and nor is it some percentage between 0 and 100%, but each has a different role to play in the causal chain from genome to developing brain, interacting with input from the senses, resulting in further learning and so on. So I think we're getting better at sketching out the causal chain. But I think the general framework of the role of evolution and genetics in human psychology, which I played out with Steve Gould and Stephen Rose and Richard Lewontin, and in a different way with Noam Chomsky and Jerry Fodor, even though both of them are much more strongly on the nature side than I am, because they both in their own ways have allergies to the idea of Darwinian natural selection as the source of the nature part, that put into sharp light what the nature of our innate endowment is, where it came from, and what we should expect it to look like.
Actually, speaking of endowment and maybe also worldviews. I mean, I think this is why you were so welcome at AEI, frankly. We have kind of a tragic view as opposed to a utopian view, and also this sense of, I mean, there's a deep connection between ideas, I believe, of innateness and personal responsibility, which is to say that you're not completely at the mercy of your environment, that you are a determining being. But in that context, I know that a political philosopher named Thomas Sowell has had a role in your work. Can you describe that?
Yeah, Tom Sowell was trained as an economist. He's at Stanford at the Hoover Institution, but he has written on an astonishing range of topics, including the one that led him to contact me. Namely, he wrote a book on language delay, inspired by the fact that his own son was pretty much mute until the age of 4, but highly talented in other spheres of cognition. He tells a story of the boy knocking over a chessboard that Tom himself was in the midst of playing remotely, and Tom got mad at him, and whereupon the 2-year-old boy put every chess piece back in its exact place. So there's clearly an uneven intellectual development, no language, but highly advanced spatial cognition. And so Tom wrote a book on language delay, not from the point of view of a psycholinguist, but consulting me for comments. And I had known about his widespread writing in economics, in culture, in history, and in history of ideas. And that began a friendship that included the fact we're both photography nerds, and both interested in human nature. I think Tom is truly brilliant and underappreciated, in large part because, as you kind of hinted without saying in so many words, he is very strongly on the political right. I am not strongly on the political right or on the political left, but one, I think, recurring lesson in my own intellectual autobiography is that it's a real mistake to pick either to be, when you're inspired by someone, to buy the entire inventory of ideas. I think you have to pick and choose. I've also taken important lessons from Noam Chomsky, who is as farther to the left than Tom Sowell is to the right. Everyone has interesting ideas. You can't be a ditto head and swallow the entire agenda. In Tom's case, aside from his book on late-talking children and his work on economics, he wrote a fascinating book called A Conflict of Visions on why the various left-wing opinions should hang together and why the various right-wing opinions should hang together, which you wouldn't necessarily, just looking at the list casually, think would have any underlying intellectual coherence. So if you ask someone, are you in favor of the death penalty? Chances are they would also be more sympathetic to religion. They would be more skeptical about social welfare programs. They would be have a more hawkish foreign policy. Conversely, if someone was committed to worrying about global warming, they'd also be concerned with economic inequality. They'd favor early education programs. So why is it? And Tom argued that it really boils down to two different visions of human nature, whether you have an inherently tragic vision, namely that we are all saddled with certain flaws and shortcomings because of our innate endowment. We're subject to self-serving biases and short-sightedness and selfishness, and therefore any social arrangement has to take the flaws of human nature into account, as opposed to a utopian vision in which humans are pretty much blank slates, where the right parenting, the right social programs, the right media programming can shape people into whatever form is socially desirable. And he argued in that book that all of these particular opinions can fall out of these two fundamentally different visions of human nature.
Yeah, it's a great book. So you've had, in addition to the debates we just mentioned, you participated in a charged discussion with Larry Summers, the president of Harvard, and it's had to do with where Larry Summers even suggested there may be innate differences in gender and mathematical ability, but not to pursue that so much. But my question is, these are we could call them taboo subjects, third rail kinds of issues. What kind of advice do you have for folks who are in the field and are interested in these, but are also a little bit nervous about the implications for their career.
Yeah, it is a charged subject because many topics in psychology touch on various taboos simply because human behavior is what everyone's interested in. There aren't all that many raging debates over fungi, so if you're a mycologist, you have a blessed life compared to being a psychologist. I would say, first of all, choose your controversies carefully. Don't just be outrageous on everything at once. Pick a topic in which there are a lot of data, and so the debate can be as scientific as possible. Don't take outrageous opinions that aren't well supported by the data. Frame them in a way that is not deliberately inflammatory, that acknowledges the potential dangers and shows how they don't necessarily lead to the actual dangers. And maybe get tenure before you start talking about them.
waiting for the T word there.
Yes, right. As flawed as tenure is, and it's not a system that anyone, I think, could justify from scratch, I think in today's environment it does serve a purpose. And there's no question that if I didn't have tenure, I would not have written on all the topics that I've written about.
So tenure is a good institution from that standpoint alone. So in the Better Angels of Our Nature, one of the sections you have is on moral progress. And certainly we've made great strides. No one would even, slavery is clearly a thing of the past. Women's rights are flourishing. Animal cruelty is abated, never enough, but certainly much less of a problem than it was years and years ago. So my question is, if you were to update Better Angels in 100 years, what do you think we'd look back on in 100 years and think, oh my gosh, we did those things in 2015?
Yeah, I suspect that nuclear weapons might be high on the list, that there's something particularly mad about nuclear weapons. They're militarily useless, other than deterring an all-out invasion, and even then they're in practice useless because of the great taboo against actually using them. So that's how come Argentina could defy Britain over the Falklands, knowing that Britain was not actually going to use their nukes to render Buenos Aires a radioactive crater over the Falklands. And so they did exactly what nuclear theory, deterrence theory, says they shouldn't do, a non-nuclear power threatening a nuclear one. Since they're almost by definition unthinkably massive war crimes, that is, millions of non-combatants die, which is what should not happen in a war, their very existence is monstrous. I don't think that they deserve responsibility for preventing war after 1945, superpower war. There is a coherent, non-utopian, non-romantic movement that plots out a blueprint on how they might be eliminated. President Obama actually signed on to it early in his presidency, which is one of the reasons he won the Nobel Prize. So it was derailed by a number of things. He had other headaches like Putin and the Middle East, and it got sort of taken off the world's agenda. But 100 years, it's quite possible that nuclear weapons will be dismantled, and our great-grandchildren will be shaking their heads as to how we ever lived with them. Other things might be certainly many factory farming practices. It would be very hard to defend. The incarceration of people for nonviolent crimes like drug possession, we're already starting to see a tipping point. Then, of course, in much of the world, there are practices such as the toleration of violence against women or restrictions of women, and throwing people in jail for free speech, where the advanced Western democracies are already enjoying progress, and there's still a lot of room for the rest of the world to catch up.
Right. I hope you're right. We'll meet here. We'll meet back in 100 years. I'm quoting you here, Steven. You said that, quote, "Psychology sits at the center of intellectual life. In one direction, it looks to the biological sciences, to neuroscience, to genetics and evolution. but on the other it looks to social sciences and the humanities, end quote. So do you think that psychology programs are doing a good job of integrating those fields? That's part one of my question. And then do you think, well, this is related, if they're doing it enough, they're able to do it in a broad-minded manner, and I say that with respect to the work of Jonathan Haidt and Phil Tetlock, who've documented a notable liberal slant in the membership of the profession.
Yeah. I don't think psychology is doing it enough. I think psychology is too important a topic to be left to psychologists. That in most areas of psychology, there are huge amounts of insight, particularly when it comes to explanations, theories, ideas that have to come from other disciplines. I think you can't study the psychology of language without knowing linguistic theory. I think you can't understand visual perception without knowing something about computer vision. You can't do social psychology without knowing game theory and evolutionary theory. So I think the psychology curriculum should not just recount the history of P is less than 0.05 experiments, but has to invoke deeper theories, often from other fields. And I do think that the strong political monoculture of much of psychology is an impediment to scientific progress. Namely, there are certain hypotheses that are simply not on the table because they are unthinkable, and that this is not to prejudge whether any of those hypotheses are true or false, but unless you entertain them, how do you know whether they're true or false? There was just to give an example, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of days ago, a column actually, on a finding relating cortical thickness to poverty, that kids from poorer neighborhoods have thinner cerebral cortexes. And it went on to argue, well, this just shows about the effects of plasticity, how a deprived environment shrinks your gray matter. And maybe that's true, but the G word wasn't even mentioned as a hypothesis, namely the possibility that people vary because of their genome and how thick their gray matter is. In fact, we know from twin studies that, in fact, there is a heritable component to gray matter thickness. Whether that's the cause of the socioeconomic status differences, we can't know unless you look at both heritability and stimulation and SES in a proper regression analysis. But if you take one potential factor and you don't even test it, you're guaranteed to be ignorant about it. And I think that's just one of many examples that John Haidt and Phil Tetlock and their collaborators, I think, correctly point out in their Behavioral and Brain Sciences article that has retarded the progress of our science.
Do you see any change over the years, or that's been pretty much static, the proportion of...
No, I think there is a change. I think it is improving. That just looking at the introductory psychology textbooks, for example, they now tend to include a respectful discussion of behavioral genetics when it comes to explaining intelligence and psychological disorders, more so than the textbooks that I grew up with. Likewise, the role of evolution in helping to understand altruism tends to be in the curriculum, which was not true 20 or 30 years ago. So I think there is progress.
That's encouraging. Well, about teaching, you've won lots of teaching awards. I did not mention that in your introduction. Advice for teachers out there and graduate students who are about to become teachers.
Right. I'll be speaking about that later today and giving the David Myers lecture, in fact, on teaching. Although I'm going to concentrate in that lecture on writing, because it's what my most recent book was about. But I think the psychology of writing and the psychology of teaching overlap a lot, and that what makes a good writer often makes a good teacher. In particular, I would single out two principles. One of them is concreteness and vividness. When you become an expert in a subject, you tend to think about it more and more abstractly, and you forget all the concrete sensory details that the human mind really needs to understand something. So you talk about a stimulus instead of a bunny rabbit, or you talk about an emotional response instead of your heart rate goes up. A lot of opaque writing comes from omitting perceptual detail in favor of abstraction, and a lot of, I think, ineffective teaching does the same thing. Not because people are trying to sound highfalutin and fancy and to bamboozle and impress, but just it's the natural psychological response to becoming an expert. You tend to have bigger and bigger and more abstract chunks, and you forget that novices need to be reminded of physical events in order to understand them. And the other is being aware of a phenomenon that has been rediscovered many times in psychology, but my favorite name for it comes from an economist. It's called the curse of knowledge. The difficulty that we have in imagining what it's like not to know something that we do know. And in psychology, it's also called mind blindness, failure of theory of mind, hindsight bias, egocentrism. There are many different forms of it. When we teach, when we write, we are apt to project our own state of knowledge outward and assume that background assumptions on why our questions are interesting, what our jargon means, are just common knowledge. They're second nature. And we forget that people who are as smart as we are, but just haven't gone through the same history of learning that we have, need to start from the beginning and have concepts explained, abstractions fleshed out, jargon terms defined. So overcoming the curse of knowledge. We also know from psychology, one of many areas in which psychological science makes us more effective in all spheres of life, that the traditional advice of how to overcome the curse of knowledge, namely empathize harder, put yourself in the other guy's shoes and see the world from their point of view, actually doesn't work very well, because for one thing, the curse of knowledge prevents us from overcoming the curse of knowledge. We're not even aware of what we take for granted, almost by definition, and just trying harder isn't enough. Feedback signals are essential. Showing your manuscript to other people in the case of writing, and you're often shocked to find out that what's obvious to you isn't obvious to anyone else. And in the case of teaching, the kind of feedback that you get from constant assessment. And any people in this room who are teachers know that when you get assignments back, you're often stunned to find how shallow and incomplete the level of understanding is, not because the students are lazy or stupid, but because you, the teacher, have failed to spell out some of the foundations that you take for granted, but that they have no way of knowing.
I know, that's a horrible feeling when the first time you realize the curse of knowledge is when you're giving your talk.
Yes.
And that's,
yes.
So do you write for academic journals anymore, or is that a thing of the past?
Yes, no, I still I go through the agonies of revise and resubmit and reviewer number 3 and all of that, yeah.
Well, just briefly, because I know these things get extremely complicated, but what was the last academic paper you wrote?
The last,
one of the last
major one was a paper in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, published by the association whose name may not be mentioned here, on phenomenon of common knowledge and coordination. And I'm very excited about this. It's the phenomenon of the difference between everyone knowing something and everyone knowing that everyone else knows it. That is, I know that you know that I know that you know that I know that you know ad infinitum, which is received some technical analysis in economics and game theory and logic and linguistics, but very little in psychology. But I think it's a profound topic for psychology. I think we have a sensitivity to the difference between mere shared knowledge and common knowledge. We see it in idioms like the elephant in the room and the emperor's new clothes, and metaphors like, it's out there, you can't take it back. I think it's, we navigate our social relationships via common knowledge. I'm your friend because I know that you know that I know that you know, or I'm your superior or subordinate or business partner or sexual partner or romantic partner because of this common knowledge. A lot of phenomena of social life, such as innuendo, taboo, euphemism, doublespeak, come from our attempt to convey information while preventing it from becoming common knowledge. the difference between a blurting out something and hinting at it by innuendo even when it's transparent. The difference between would you like to come up and see my etchings and would you like to come up and have sex, even when no adult can fail to understand the meaning of etchings. Why would that make a why does that make such a psychological difference? Because with the etchings, there is some deniability about whether the other person knows that you know, whereas when you blurt something out, it's a common knowledge generator. And I think there's a vast number of social phenomena, most of which deal with the problem of coordination. That is, cases in which the optimal behavior for you depends on what the other person does, and there are multiple possibilities, each of which can benefit you, but as long as they're the same. There's been so much of a focus in the evolution of social behavior on altruism, cases in which I confer a benefit to you at a cost to myself, that we've lost sight of the other logical possibility for social behavior, namely coordination. Or mutualism, I'm sorry. I do something that benefits you and it benefits me at the same time. If we both drive on the right, if we both use the compatible file formats in exchanging documents, if we both agree either to be good friends or business associates, but not mix them. Common knowledge, I think, is what allows coordination for mutual benefit to happen. And there are a huge array of social phenomena that are governed by our sensitivity to I know that he knows that I know that he knows. And in this paper we have some pilot experiments just to show that people are highly sensitive to common knowledge when making risky decisions on how to coordinate their behavior with other people.
Wow. What's the title?
Coordination and Common Knowledge.
Oh, okay. I thought it was some cute title. Sometimes
yeah, no, like The Elephant in the Room or Don't Go There or something.
Yeah,
no,
Don't Go There, I like that. Back to students for a second. There was a book that came out last year called Excellent Sheep by a man whose name I can't pronounce, William Deresiewicz?
Deresiewicz,
okay. And basically he talked about students at elite schools and how conformist they were and how they're not being encouraged to indulge in creativity or analysis. But you wrote an article, I think it was in the New Republic, with a different view, and it seemed that you were kind of unique in your defense of the student body. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, so this was a kind of extended character assassination of Ivy League students, which in my experience was totally unwarranted. I think they're not, as he put it twice, entitled out of touch little shits, and I quote. They're very fine, generous, respectful, serious people. But that wasn't really the crux of the article. The crux was actually to partly to expose actually a concern that both Deresiewicz and I share, which is that the admissions criteria for elite universities are in many ways bizarre. That is, you think, well, people say, oh, you're teaching at Harvard, they must be such brilliant, cerebral students. And the answer is no. Like, a lot of them were chosen because they were good at the lacrosse team and they played the bassoon and they edited the school newspaper, and their parents gave a lot of money to Harvard, and they came from rural Wyoming. We need more Wyoming students. And a very small percentage of them were chosen for intellectual merit or interests. And once they get there, they treat, in many of the Ivies, they treat, and elite universities, they kind of treat academics kind of the way you might treat shuffleboard on a cruise ship. It's like one of a huge number of options, and not necessarily the most important one. Maybe you go to the buffet or the movie, and and a lot of my students, they say the most important experience they've had at Harvard is singing in the a cappella group. And it's like, hey, well, what about us professors and our courses and all these things that worry about? And the priorities of the Ivies, I think, are skewed. And I think that if both, and of course, they can get away with it because of, I think, a rather corrupt system where a lot of financial firms and tech companies use graduation from a name brand university as a criteria for hiring. I think that objective testing, both as an admissions criterion and as a hiring criterion, could get rid of a lot of unfairness in the system. And we tend to forget there's so much bias against testing, that testing was originally a highly progressive, indeed left liberal movement, because it would subvert class privilege and base advancement on raw talent and achievement. And I think more of an emphasis on objective measures, not necessarily the tests we have now, over subjective criteria, which as psychologists, we know that clinical, subjective, personal decision making is not as accurate as more actuarial, statistical, data-driven decision. And that was really the bottom line of the article, to tie it back to psychology.
So we have a few more minutes. Let me ask you about photography. I know that's one of your hobbies. Is there a coffee table book in your future, or a more substantive academic book about photography? I have,
at any one time, I have like 4 or 5 ideas for books that I might or might not write at some time in the future. And I do sometimes think of combining my rather nerdy interest in photography with my more scientific interest to write a book on the photographic mind, the psychology of photography, that would include visual perception, environmental aesthetics, some of the philosophical questions of to what extent is a photograph an objective representation, all the more poignant in an era of Photoshop editing. On the other hand, I'm sometimes deterred from doing that by the thought that this is one area in which I can just kind of get into a flow without having to think about my critics and controversies. And if I suddenly merge that private zone of just pure pleasure in the maelstrom of academic disputation, then I might kind of destroy one of my main anxiety reduction techniques. So I have second thoughts.
You may leave it alone. Is it mostly nature photography?
No, everything. People, urban photography, anything that's interesting to look at.
And what's your current project?
The exploration of common knowledge and is my main research activity, although I've also been involved in studies of emotional expression. I have a paper on what angry faces are for with Ian Reid. I have a paper on critical periods in second language acquisition with Josh Hartshorn and Josh Tenenbaum. And I'm pondering a kind of a short manifesto on science, reason, and enlightenment, driven by data showing how much improvement there has been in the human condition, not just in violence, which I have written about, but in pretty much every other sphere of human flourishing, that we're living longer, fewer children are dying, fewer mothers are dying, more people are going to school, people are richer, positive, quantifiable developments that many people in the world are unaware of, and that I think can be attributed to the growth of science, reason, and humanistic values.
Can you give us one example that you think you thought most people weren't aware that violence declined? I know that.
Yes, that's right. People are not aware that homicide, rape, child abuse, war deaths, when plotted quantitatively as opposed to driven by the availability heuristic, namely examples that you can remember, the graphs all go down. But what I didn't spell out in the Better Angels of Our Nature, and which is, I think, worth a further explanation, is that it's not just violence, but everything else that could go wrong in life that has decreased, like disease, like extreme poverty, like illiteracy and ignorance. And that, again, as psychologists, we know that our impressions of the world are far too driven by anecdotes, stoked by the very nature of news. News is about stuff that happens, not about stuff that doesn't happen. More things can go wrong than can go right. And so event-driven information streams, in other words, the news, will distort our appreciation of the state of the world, especially as we become better and better at reporting the news worldwide. So we always think that the world is going to hell, And it's only when you plot data on, as best you can, on how many kids survive the first year of life, how many kids go to school, that you realize that things are getting better. And if twice as many kids in Africa go to school now as did in the past, there's never any Thursday in which that's a headline. Likewise, if fewer mothers die in childbirth, if fewer people get malaria, that is never a headline. It's never something you can click on unless you follow the trends. I think the noble people who try to quantify the state of the world, and I think that deserves much greater attention.
Thank you. And actually, my last question is advice for the group.
I do think, just to repeat a point I made earlier, that psychology is too important to be left to psychologists, that it really is at the center of human concerns. It is the societies and political systems are the products of human psychology, namely people negotiating agreements to coexist and cooperate and coordinate. The arts are products of human psychological faculties. Music is related to auditory perception, painting to visual perception, poetry and fiction to our capacity for language, and they're driven by our social psychology. And in the other direction, you can't understand where our psychology came from unless you appreciate both the biological sources, neuroscience, genetics, evolution, and the laws governing complex interacting systems, artificial intelligence, computation, game theory, information theory, complexity theory. So being interested in the human mind requires being interested in many other things, and collectively, that's what's going to advance our understanding of what makes us tick.
Okay. Well, thank you, Steven Pinker, and thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.